Recording has started. So we all go?
Yep.
Yep.
A warm welcome to all of you. I'm Jeff Ray, the moderator for today's discussion on what's wrong with environmental science and what should be done about it. Before I introduce our speakers, I would like to invite Harry Wilkinson and Tom Bostock to each say a few words on behalf of our hosts, the UK Global Warming Policy Forum and the Australian Environment Foundation. Harry is Head of Policy at the GWPF and Tom is Chairman of AEF. Harry, the floor is yours.
Well, good morning, Jeffrey from London. It's a complete privilege for the GWPF to be jointly hosting this event with the Australian Environment Foundation. This is such an important topic. We've seen all around the world that the scientific process has been damaged by groupthink and by people who have been willing to express their own scientific findings that don't accord with what is the preferred opinions. And so this is a vital topic, and a special shout out, I should say, first of all, to all our Australian followers, readers, supporters. We're very grateful to our supporters in Australia, and we're following events there very closely. In particular, we've watched Dr. Peter Ridd's case at James Cook University with interest, and I know many of our supporters have supported him in his legal case as well, and we're absolutely delighted to do so because of the importance of that case to freedom of speech and freedom of academic inquiry in Australia and around the world. And we're lucky enough to have had both Joe, Nova and Peter come and speak to us in London as well. So we're delighted to be re-engaging with you all, and we've seen the work of the Australian Environment Foundation, and it's very encouraging to see. So I'm sure it's going to be a fantastic event today, and I look forward to hearing what everyone has to say.
Thanks, Harry. Now to Tom Bostock. Tom?
Thank you, Jeff. It's both a pleasure and an honour for AEF to have the Global Warming Policy Forum as a co-venture in this webinar. Both bodies are dedicated to assessing environmental issues through the lens of evidence-based science as opposed to ideology. And if that reveals a problem, to finding the most cost-effective solution. AEF looks forward to continuing collaboration with GWPF in that cause. On behalf of AEF, I give Harry and his colleagues at GWPF warmest thanks for giving us the benefit of their experience in setting up and conducting this webinar. This webinar is for AEF, another in a series of annual events to commemorate the life and work of our late director, Robert Bob Carter, who was Professor of Geology at James Cook University from 1981 to 1998, and adjunct professor until 2013, when it was terminated by James Cook University on account of Bob's skepticism about catastrophic anthropogenic global warming. Bob Carter was a director of AEF and directed several AEF conferences, And Bob was a fearless warrior for truth in science against those groups and universities who claimed to support the ideals of free speech and the clash of ideas, but would close down debate if the wrong ideas were being expressed. I note with pleasure that Bob Carter's widow, Anne, has enrolled for this webinar, and on behalf of us all, I extend to Anne a very special welcome. I pass the baton back to Jeff Ray in the hope that you'll all be stimulated by the following presentations to participate with questions and comments in the discussions afterwards.
Thanks, Tom. And now on to our three speakers. Each of them will start by briefly outlining an area where the science has been shown to have a significant problem. They'll then come together as a panel to discuss how we should think about fixing the problem. During this time, members of the audience may submit questions to the speakers by using the Q&A widget, which is on the bottom of your screen in the middle. Click on it and type in your question. Harry Wilkinson will manage the process and end up putting the questions to our panelists. So now, our first presentation will be by Peter Ridd on the Great Barrier Reef. Peter?
Thanks, Jeff. So the Great Barrier Reef, everybody around the world has been told that it's on its last legs, but anybody who actually visits it will tell you the exact opposite. In fact, it's in wonderful condition. So not only is it supposedly being killed by climate change, but also agriculture on the coast is supposedly polluting it with pesticides and sediment. But when you actually look at the statistics on the reef, the coral cover now is about the same as when records began, and is probably no different to when Captain Cook sailed up the coast. The effect of farmers, the pesticide concentrations are effectively not detectable, even with the most remarkable scientific equipment. The effect of sediment, which is supposedly smothering the reef, according to many commentators. I worked on sediment for 25 years on the reef, and in fact, you're flat out finding even any grains of sediment on the Great Barrier Reef. If farming was killing the reef, then the first thing you'd expect to see was the growth rate of the corals slow down, but the measurements of coral growth rate, if anything, indicate that it's increased over the last 100 years since agriculture has begun. Now, one of the problems with the reef is it's almost been complicit in this story that it's dying, because occasionally large amounts of the reef are killed by cyclones. So a cyclone or hurricane can literally kill an area of coral the size of Belgium or Holland overnight. It will just be gone. And the bleaching events, which are entirely natural and have always occurred, can kill also large amounts of coral. So, of course, what happens is you only hear when the coral goes down, the coral cover goes down. You never hear about the 10 years where it all recovers until, again, you hear when it collapses. So one of the problems with the science, the so-called science, is that so much of it is not actually properly checked. But occasionally it does happen. And at the beginning of this year, in fact, Tim Clark and a group of 6 other international scientists checked about 8 to 10 pieces of work from the James Cook University Coral Reef Centre, which supposedly said that carbon dioxide concentration were changing the behaviour of coral reef fish. One of the things was supposedly it changed their sense of smell and they'd swim toward predators and get eaten. It was crazy stuff. Anyway, Tim Clark checked this stuff and found that it was all 100% wrong. 8 major studies, 100% wrong. But of course, most of the time, this stuff is not properly checked. It is only peer reviewed. And peer review is a very cursory check, maybe a quick read by a couple of hours by your peers. And peers are often your mates. And the peer group actually essentially forms almost like a bully group. If you're external to the peer group, you get excluded, the dissenters get pushed out. And this is a huge problem with the system. And what then happens is that politicians are essentially blackmailed by the scientific institutions. It's a very brave politician that stands up to the science institutions and says, I don't really believe what you're saying about the reef. They can expect the institutions to come back at them in the media saying that they are deniers and it's bad for their political career. It's a bit like a hit job from the mafia. So what we really need is a system of checking the science, because so much of it is wrong. Obviously not all of it, a lot of it's doubtless very solid. I often contrast the situation with what I call policy science, which is what governments use, to the sort of science that a commercial enterprise will use. Say, for example, in the aeronautical industry, where if there's a bit of a science is used for, say, an aircraft engine, then the motto is check, 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 because people are going to die if you get this wrong. This doesn't happen in policy science and in the environmental sciences. And we need a system where governments actually, who are using the science for policy, actually pay to check it. And I think I better hand over to the next speaker. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you very much, Peter. And our next speaker is the redoubtable Jo Nova, and she'll be telling us about bushfires. Thank you, Jo.
Thank you. Well, and what a job to try and sum up the fire situation in 5 minutes. And ladies and gentlemen, it's very different to the coral reef story that Peter Ridd just described. Instead of something which is working just fine and being beat up and described a disaster, the disaster that was the year of the summer 2020 in Australia was truly a man-made ordeal of the worst kind. In the final toll, 33 people were killed, 2 or 3 billion animals died. Some nearly 3,000 homes were destroyed, and a plume of smoke stretched from Australia to South America. Things got so severe, towns were cut off for a few days. The Australian Navy had to rescue 1,000 people. And 1,000 miles away in New Zealand, the glaciers got covered in brown dust and the sunsets turned orange thanks to what was formerly forest in Australia being converted into stratospheric ash. So the cost of all this man-made disaster is in the order of $100 billion. And unless heads roll and policies change, this cycle repeats every 10 to 20 years in Australia. To get a long-term perspective on it, we burnt about 18 million hectares this time around. That's 186,000 square kilometres of ground, which sounds enormous, but an average fire year in Australia is 50 million hectares. It's usually even larger because it's normally desert and northern dry areas rather than these dense forests. That's why it made the news. And therein lies the really key point to this, which is the difference between desert bush, desert scrub, and these dense forests. And that's the fuel that underlies it all. And to give us that long-term perspective, the worst fires in the Victorian history in Australia were all the way back in 1851, when about a quarter of the entire state of Victoria was consumed in the Black Thursday fires. So much for climate change. Australia's been dealing with fires forever. Now, something everyone needs to understand about fires, just really briefly, is the Australian trees love fire. They've been tens of thousands of years of selection by the Indigenous people here have created they've pulled the trees out that like fire and have adapted to fire. So the idea that we can't have fires in Australia is ridiculous, but what we need is a fire management system that isn't going to result in these kind of pyroconvective disasters. Now, here in WA, it's a drier state and the driest continent on Earth. I'll just show you a graph of the last 70 years of fire management here. So bear with me for a second. This graph is 70 years of fire management. The green line is prescribed burns. The red line are the wildfires and the area that burnt in wildfires. Now, back in 1960-61, we had a disastrous series of fires here, and the response in policy was the obvious thing: to do more cool burns, to reduce that undergrowth and scrub, and keep the level of fuel down. And you can see the incredible amount of fire burning they did. Now, for the next 20 years, we just didn't have wildfires of any note in Western Australia. It's remarkable. Then you can see as the prescribed burns fell enough, we got more and more wildfires. It's so predictable. This is the one dominant factor that we have control over. So that's a graph I show over and over, never get bored of putting that graph forward. And thanks to the Bushfire Front website, you can find out all about, from people who manage the fires here, what they consider to be the most important thing, which are the three factors that make fire grow in the chemistry of it: oxygen, that's the wind; heat, that's the temperature, of course; and fuel. And of those three factors, it's beyond obvious to say we don't have control over the wind and the temperature. But the Greens and the Labor Party, the mainstream policy in Australia, is that that is exactly what they're going to do to reduce fires. Their policy is to reduce fires by reducing global temperatures of the whole planet by 1/100th of a degree Celsius, if we're lucky, and tactically by putting in solar panels and wind farms, we hope that we might achieve something 100 years from now. So all I can say is in the lead up to the 2020 disastrous bushfire season in Australia, we installed more renewable energy per capita than any nation on earth, bar none. So we've tried that and it didn't work. So for those who manage fires know, the only factor that we can control is the fuel. This is something we've known about for years. There have been something like 57 bushfire inquiries, which have all come to almost the same conclusion. And yet our policy in the national news is still discussing climate change as if it's the key factor we might be able to control. In the meantime, we're effectively leaving barrels of oil uncovered in the hot sun, and we're hoping that lightning won't strike. Only worse, these are aerosolized barrels of oil. That's what Australian trees do. We don't need chemical detectors to know that. The gum trees fill the air with a blue haze visible to our eyes. They don't call them the Blue Mountains outside Sydney for nothing. So I think the last 2 points I want to make, the key factor in Australian fires are the droughts. And that's the factor that climate models have absolutely no ability to predict. We've had 178 years of rainfall record here. It shows no trend. In the southeast corner of Australia, where the worst fires were, no trend in 178 years of fires. So it's pretty obvious that climate change, or CO2, is not driving what's going on with our forests and fires. It's the fuel loads and Pacific cycles that we can't predict. And the last point, for those who like numbers, is the intensity of fires, which is measured in kilowatts per metre of fire front. I think this is really critical. And if we look at the studies done 60 years ago, even then and ever since, they say cool burns should be done at 300 kilowatts per metre. That's the intensity of the fire line on the front, 300 kilowatts. So remember that number. A high intensity fire in Australia is listed as 500 kilowatts per square metre. And that's what Australian trees want, the seeds, they want that high intensity fire. But if we get 3,000 kilowatts per metre on the front line, that's out of control. We just can't stop those fires with no matter how many water bombers and trucks. And fires of 7,000 kilowatts, so we're ramping it up, they are the ones that burn 15 metres high. We're talking about the canopy. The koalas have nowhere to escape. They're at the tops of the trees. They're going to get burnt. There's nowhere they can go. The fires that we saw this year, to finish on in Australia, the fires that we got were not 7,000 kilowatts per metre. They were 70,000 kilowatts per metre. They are so beyond our control. It is a man-made catastrophe of the grandest order. And for thousands of years, the Indigenous people of Australia managed the forests to avoid these kind of disasters by doing thousands of cool burns all the time to reduce that undergrowth. But green policy for climate change suggests we want to store our carbon. We want to keep all that undergrowth and all the dead wood. And it encourages everyone to build up that fire load. And that is a huge problem. And I'll hand over now to Alan Moran to talk about the rivers and the river systems of the East Coast in Australia.
Thanks, Joe. Well, scientific instigated economic destruction found a new flavour with the Murray-Darling Basin, which is really Australia's only significant irrigation region and has been developed over the 70 years, or was developed over the 70 years to 1990. And the river system runs through a relatively arid area, which as a result of the irrigation became responsible for about 40% of Australia's agricultural output. By 1990, about half of the Murray-Darling waters, about 12,000 gigalitres a year, had been allocated for irrigation, and a cap was placed on new diversions in 1999. But soon after that, the so-called Wentworth group of concerned scientists started agitating for irrigation to be reduced. The AMBIC claim was for a reduction from the 12,000 gigalitres by 7,000 gigalitres. And the rationale was a supposed salinization of the soils in the area, said to be caused by salt being brought to the surface in the irrigation process. Not only were pseudo-scientific papers written on the subject, but a panoply of media activities was organized. This included flights over salt pans said to be created by the irrigation process and confected stories about declining yields. The official basin salinity strategy spuriously estimated that increased salinity brings costs of about $294 million per annum to the basin. It even said median salinity levels would exceed Australian drinking water guidelines for good quality water within 50 years or so. And unfortunately, we saw key farmer organizations joining the lobbying because they thought they saw the opportunity for new subsidies and therefore stoked the fires in some major ways. At this time, a second line of attack on using the water for productive purposes came from scientific papers that claimed agricultural diversions in reducing environmental water supply were resulting in dying gum trees and depleted fish and wildlife numbers. In reality, the rivers under human control have a steady flow, bringing what most people regard as being environmental benefits, as well as improved leisure uses and more productive farming. In the natural state, the rivers would alternatively flood and run totally dry. Over recent years, measured flows have ranged from 118,000 gigalitres back in 1956 to little under 7,000 gigalitres in 2006. So we see annual flows varying around the mean between 4 and 5 fold. And that is the natural rate, which was disturbed, of course, by human intervention. But even though that we've seen this volatility, we've also seen no change in the average flows over the period of 150 years that the river has been rather meticulously measured. So the average flows have stayed the same, but nonetheless, when the global warming scare became central to policy formulation, without skipping a beat, activist scientists declared that it is causing a reduction in the amount of water which would be available for the Murray-Darling, and that increased allocations for an environment would be needed. Papers were published by government agricultural agencies like the Australian Bureau of Agricultural Research and by the Chief Commonwealth organization called CSIRO, and in academia, which highlighted the supposed problems. We saw activist academics like Professor Flannery and Garneau reporting on amplifying these claims and bringing about policy recommendations with rather deleterious consequences. And spooked by the so-called scientists, concerned scientists, much influenced by the drought which occurred called the Millennium Drought in the early part of this century, and pandering to inner city green city interests, politicians decided to reduce irrigators' high security water by almost 40%. They did so largely by buying up the water, cost about $13 billion. And as a result, the consequent shortage led to a price surge in the traded water, in some cases by up to tenfold. The cost of all this, in terms of output per year, has been about $3 billion. But this actually understates the real cost, which of course means capital costs and lifestyle costs, especially to those in the region. And moreover, we has incited and energized political groups calling for further action and created a vast new bureaucracy. Having set this in place, legislation makes rolling back the takings very difficult to do. And a future government will seek probably green votes by renewing the attack on modern farming and building upon further bogus research. The disruption was and cost to taxpayers, especially the basin communities, was incurred by hysteria whipped up by Greens and fed by activist authored and mainly government funded reports. So how are we to prevent these harmful outcomes being repeated? Ensuring against specious findings in the 30,000 or so scientific journals containing 1 million different papers a year is a massive task. I think one option we have to consider is to reduce and even eliminate government-funded scientific research, at least that which drives policy. We've seen much of science flipped from promoting to retarding the pursuit of economic well-being. Does this funding still pass a net benefit test? Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Now, at this juncture, we move into the panel discussion. Please don't forget, there's time to submit questions. To do so, use the Q&A widget at the bottom of your screen. I might start the discussion rolling by asking the panelists where they think the research process is most likely to fail with a loss of credibility for the research results. In other words, where should we focus our attention on reforms to improve the outcomes that we've seen in your presentations?
Well, maybe if I can go first. For the case of the reef, and even for the bushfires, and for, well, maybe not the bushfires because we know the answer for that one, but for the Murray-Darling, you look just to the major scientific papers upon which the scientific policy, the government policy rests, and then you do audits on those. I once asked the director of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority how many scientific studies would need to be audited, and his answer was about a dozen. I was going to say 20, but he said about a dozen. So it's not a big job. You know, I've estimated you could do it for maybe $4 or $5 million. You could check all the major findings on the reef for $4 or $5 million. By the way, you'd find there'd be huge failure. But compared with the amount of money that we're spending on the reef, this is a very tiny amount of money.
Do any other of the panelists want to respond?
It's difficult. I would say everywhere is a problem right from the beginning to the end, from the way we do our ARC grants, the fact that the governments have a monopsony. They are the only buyer of scientific research. So there's no competition at the start. There's also no competition at the end, I guess, with the government's control of limited media sources. We get some freedom on the internet, but we're finding that pinched by the censorship coming from the tech giants and their monopolistic roles. So even PAL Review, can I throw that one out as a reason why we're getting less competition between scientists? Because they don't want to offend other scientists who may be their pals to review their next paper. Often they put 27 names on a paper. It becomes a joint effort because they all want to count it as one more paper on their tally. And so everything about it is designed to stop individual scientists competing almost. It's become mass groupthink from beginning to end. I don't know what the answer is to that, but I really would like us, if we can, to focus on the incentives, because I think we have to rejig all the incentives for scientists to somehow have an interest in finding the truth. And how do we do that? How do we get back to a system where scientists actually want to find problems in other people's papers? And as long as they're working in giant groups and PAL reviewing each other, and we call PAL review the be all and end all of how science is judged, we will never escape that.
I think one of the things, friendly difference I had with Bob Carter all the time was he was keen to say, let's have a Royal Commission into climate change. And the problem with this is that, you know, the Royal Commission into climate change, as would be the case in the verifiers of existing research, would be picked by the government. And we wouldn't get a Bob Carter or a Peter Ridd. We'd get, you know, Ross Garnaut or Tim Flannery or Andrew McIntosh, various other people who have really been the researchers that the government have turned to create the bogus material and findings on which new policy has been developed. And I think that this is a real problem we have. The government will pick the Royal Commissioner or the research verifier that it chooses, and in doing so is just as likely to exacerbate the problem as to create a genuine verification of research which is incorrectly developed and found.
Can I respond to that, Jeff? You're absolutely right, Alan. That's the major worry. I mean, I want this Office of Policy Science Quality Assurance, where the government would have an auditing group. And of course, the worry is, will it just get captured by the bad guys and we'd be back in the same problem? But yet, when you look at the financial system, we have people called auditors, and they're independent, and somehow or other, we manage to have a system where they are most of the time genuinely independent. And I do believe it would be possible. It depends on the sorts of people you check. You need to check to see, are they in the peer group? If they're in the peer group, then they're out. They're not an auditor. There's no way that you'd get, say, a big company like BHP audited by somebody who had a huge interest in BHP, who was working for BHP, or was working with the top echelons of it. They're not going to be independent. In the case of scientists, there's lots of scientists, and there's a very famous Australian Nobel Prize winner, who I've now forgotten his name, who discovered stomach ulcers were caused by bacteria in the stomach. Now, he was on the wrong side of the peer group for a long time, and everybody laughed at him and said, look, you're a complete idiot. There's no way.
Barry Marshall, yes.
That's it, yes. But of course, eventually he was proved he was right, and he got the Nobel Prize. So he's been on the wrong side of the peer group, but he also then got became respectable again. Maybe not people of that stature, but we need people, and there's lots of scientists who've been on the wrong side of the peer group for a while. They understand where the danger is with the peer group, and they're the sorts of people that you need as your auditors.
Well, I guess, Peter, this comes back to tenure and the idea, which you thought you had, the idea that scientists don't necessarily, tell me if I'm wrong, didn't used to have to apply for 3-year grants all the time. They had a position and a job, and their job was to do that, to research. And we've shifted that now to this 3-year kind of grant application where scientists spend 1 year doing the grants, and their jobs are not so guaranteed. And so they're constantly under pressure to get enough papers and to just churn out stuff and put their names on these 37 joint papers and whatnot. And is that a structure you think we should get back to, the pure tenured professor?
I think that would certainly help. But when we come to external grants by the Australian Research Council, which is the equivalent of the American Science Foundation grants, the National Science Foundation is actually spending money just on what we're calling replication studies to do audits, right? The Australian Research Council should put aside maybe 5% of all its funds to check some of the stuff that's already been done. At the moment in the Australian Research Council rules, you're not even allowed to check. If you put in an application to check somebody else's work, it will be thrown out because it's not making new science. So yes, I think tenure and making people safe to be able to be dissidents is very important, but we actually need to set aside funding in the research councils to do those checking, and people should make a career out of checking other people's work.
And I think we've still got that problem of competition, and how do we get the incentives for getting scientists to really race against each other to find the correct answer, to get their predictions right. And a lot of that audit system is normally the media. It used to be science communicators like me, whose job it was to look at all the different science researchers and say, well, look, this guy's really making sense. And this one, well, he's obviously got his predictions wrong. So, but we're lacking that entire wave of auditing because science communicators, their role essentially has become to promote science in order to justify more grants, more money, more ARC stuff. And so there's very little criticism in the media of any of the theories. Plus, we have no scientists who are paid to find holes in the theory of global warming. And so what we end up with is a cheer squad who all support each other, and their only race is to see who can find the worst disaster rather than who can find out what's really controlling the climate. True.
But of course, in a lot of science, these auditing bodies do exist. The auditing body is the cold, hard fact. Does it work? If science is used in a commercial setting, if it doesn't work, it gets thrown out. So it's really only in these areas, these sort of soft science areas of the environment, where you make a prediction that the reef is going to be dead in 30 years' time. And in 30 years' time, you say it's going to be another 30 years, where the cold, hard reality doesn't do the auditing for you. This is the difference between the sorts of things which we're dealing with and the way science used to work up to about the 1960s. If you look at the science up to about 1960, it was either used by the military or by companies or for health, and reality determined whether it was right. But since then, we've had all these other areas of science where cold hard reality doesn't necessarily work so well.
And this is particularly the case in environmental issues. I mean, I can recall being involved in the early days in 1990 when the global warming scare came up, and a very good friend of mine who was involved in studying this and looking at the satellites said, look, Al, this is great. I'm making a lot of money as a professor and doing research into this. In 10 years, it'll all be dead because we've got all this data coming in from the satellites. It will prove that there is no catastrophic global warming taking place, and it'll all be dropped. Well, 30 years later, it's still going strong and even going stronger. I mean, so one of these things is a bit like communism. Well, you know, eventually it will be proven to be incorrect, but it took 70 years. And global warming has taken 30 odd years already, and has still not reached its peak in terms of its destructive potential on the economy. So maybe the suggestions I'm making are really in terms of reducing or eliminating research grants, or using a lot more, I think, than 5% of the money for checking, really have to be confined to the issues of environmental research, which is more difficult to disprove than the medical research over time, and has an inadequate vested interest trying to seek that disproval.
Well, and to compare environmental science to medical science, we know that databases in the medical world are rigorously controlled now compared to databases in the environmental science world, where every time someone wants to make a change or an adjustment, they've got to keep the raw data, they've got to explain the changes, it's got to be approved and things like that. But ultimately, I'm still coming back with, you know, I like Peter's idea of an audit, but I ultimately believe we have to have some more freedom of speech, free debate. And I don't know what the answer to that is, because any institute seemingly will, unless it's exposed to that public debate, will end up being captured and by the big government if it's funded by big government. Whereas if we could get people funded by the public somehow, and I don't know how that could work, but I want to connect the public with the research rather than the public through the gatekeepers. And the ARC becomes a gatekeeper who's seemingly unaccountable to the public. How often does the minister score flack over what the ARC does? The voters can't even at an election barely have a control on how the science funding is spent on the issues that matter. It seems very disconnected, which favours this disconnected science. So, you know, as I joke, tick a box on our tax returns on the things that people want every year. If voters can tick boxes on directions, on things, I want to get that connection with who pays and the end result.
Joe, I think you're absolutely right. That is important. So, for example, you do need the end user to be interested financially, and I genuinely mean that, a financial interest. So, for example, on the Great Barrier Reef, the cane farmers, the sugar cane farmers are supposedly killing the reef, and there've been massive legislation against them, which will ultimately cripple them in about 20 years' time. Now, they should be involved in an audit of the science, and they should front up with some of the cash. It might be 20%, it might be 50%. You pull out a number. The rest, I think, should be government money. But if they've got a 30% financial interest, they now can say, well, all right, we're not going to have that scientist doing these audits because we reckon he's part of the peer group. We're going to pull some out who's independent. All right. We're going to have some agreement on who can do a good audit. But if you have a financial interest in there, then you have some say on who does the actual auditing. And I think that's one of the keys to it. The industries involved, or it may be just the public, need to front up with some cash.
Peter, the Catholic Church developed a system a long time ago for determining who gets canonized, and that, part of that was to have what they call the devil's advocate, and they still use this. So any proposal for canonization, there are two teams effectively working. One is working to show that the person concerned is worthy of being canonized, and the other team is showing the exact opposite. Now, is that the sort of thing that you have in mind for the office that you've suggested?
That's precisely what we have in mind. It's no different to the legal system, to our parliamentary system. It's what financial auditors are supposed to do. They go in there and they try to find faults. They're not trying to find things that are right. They're trying to find things that are wrong. If they can't find something, well, then we presume that it's right. So that's what you need. And that's supposedly what scientists are supposed to do. But the system of peer review, or what Joe's calling PAL review, is actually the complete opposite. And you've got to force it into the system somehow or other, so that it doesn't get captured. But, you know, I reckon that even if it got captured after 10 years, you could do an awful lot of good work in 10 years. Can you imagine on the reef if suddenly these players who are publishing stuff which is just complete and utter, it's just laughably in error, if they knew that they were finally going to be audited, they'd start to watch it much more carefully. But at the moment, there are no consequences for publishing absolute, I won't use the word, just absolute rubbish. There needs to be a consequence. When we can get a consequence, the scientists will become trustworthy again.
And again, this is where I come back to the media, or the sense of accountability on what the ARC does. If the ARC had to justify why we keep giving money to people with models that fail dismally and have failed on every aspect of the rainfall, the humidity, the upper tropospheric areas, why are we still throwing money at these and not money at other people with other ideas? And that, it seems to me, the ARC is virtually unaccountable. And then we try to do science as a society by committee. Everyone doesn't want to think. We want to hand the decision over to some committee of something or other, which is going to, you know, the Climate Commission put forward by Julia Gillard, is going to give us the answers on what we're supposed to do. And committees just end up being bought and controlled by the network. So how do we get back to that organic sense of debate? Wouldn't it be great if, well, it'd be great if we sold the ABC or the BBC and all the public broadcasters, but failing selling them, if they had public debates, they'd actually rate pretty well, I think, if they were forced to get, and this is the hard part, the best of one side and the best of the other side in real public debates. I think people would want to tune into that. The problem we know is those on the believer side of the climate change debate will never agree. And they have refused every single debate offer we've put forward because they know they'll lose, and they can't afford to be seen debating people who are not professionals who outdo them.
Exactly.
So I think
just recently, I challenged the Australian Institute of Marine Science and the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority to a debate, and of course they wouldn't show up. They also claim there's absolutely no need whatsoever to check any of the science. It's all perfect, even though we've demonstrated again and again and again. For example, coral growth rates, we demonstrated that they made this terrible error in their sampling, and they'd said that it had actually crashed, but in fact it's actually increasing. So they sort of took their ball and went home, and they haven't measured coral growth rates for the last 15 years. So we've got coral growth rates from the year 1570 to the year 2005, because you measure, it's like tree rings. You can measure the rings of the coral as they grow. But from the year 2005 to 2020, we haven't got any data at all, because if they actually measured it now, they'd actually demonstrate their previous work was in error. This is how bad they are, and this is how desperate they are to avoid any debate whatsoever, and they're desperate to avoid any quality checking because they know exactly where it will go.
This climate change is a mortal threat, and we can't be bothered measuring the reef.
We've got the same sort of problems everywhere, really. Those who are in control of these citadels, the ABC and BBC, etc., they're not going to be dislodged. And nor are we probably going to see the right solution, which is to defund them or to sell them off. And again, there's a third problem, that is, once you do that, are we assured then we will get this sort of finally balanced debate? Because we don't see it in the US private system of broadcasting and newspapers, nor do we see it here in Australia. In the main part, the Nine Network and the Age, etc., are basically on the same bandwagon as the ABC. So there is a real problem with the pollution of the media itself, in terms of they have become part of the bias. partly because they want to report sensational things, which are bad things. But you know, it is very difficult to get dispassionate debates, even in a free media, which is not controlled by government entities and is self-selected in that way.
And can I say, I think if you want to let me just run right, I would say we've got to get right back to education, because it begins there, teaching kids what free speech is, what science is, and so that every kid who comes out of school ought to be able to say the one difference between science and a religion is that in science, we're willing to throw anything out if new evidence comes along. And it doesn't work like that in religion. And we've converted science into a religion by saying, you know, this professor of such and such, whatever he says or she says, that's it. That's the last word, and it will never change. And therefore, climate change, blah, blah, blah. Put a solar panel on your roof and hope that the fire doesn't burn you.
Harry, could I just ask Harry, is there anything based on the Q&A that you'd like to inject into the discussion?
Yes, I think it'd be a good time now to come in with an audience question. This discussion's been great, and I think this feeds in to what a lot of you have been talking about. We've got a few questions come in on the issue of peer review. So I've chosen this one by David Mason-Jones, and he says, there are big deficiencies in what the process of peer review can do, but the public at large seems to believe that this is actually a proof of the accuracy of a piece of research. Most average people, he suggests, think peer review is replication. So how can we influence public opinion to understand the limitations of peer review?
Can I take that one from David Mason-Jones? That goes to the heart of it. The scientific organisations have made out that peer review is a gold standard. They make out it's as though a dozen scientists check the work and they do the experiments, they do all the analysis, and then they give it a big ticker across, and that's peer review. When it's nothing like that, it's literally just a quick check for a couple of hours, usually by your mates, or often by your mates. And we've got to do more than that. And what's become in other areas of science, in the biomedical, in proper science, if you like, we're finding that the error rate of peer review is about 50%. In other words, a peer-reviewed piece of science is wrong half the time. It's an utter scandal. And, you know, when I was fired from James Cook University, I was actually saying, if you're using peer review as your sole quality assurance mechanism, then we cannot trust that work, because 50% isn't trustworthy in my book. And we've got to get the word out to the public that peer review is not what it is. It's very important. So thanks for that, David.
Yeah, and can I say, I saw William Kinnamonth, who, former brilliant leader of our National Climate Centre, has chipped in just to remind us all that CO2, of course, a building block of life. And if you think about what they've done with climate propaganda, they've undone all those years of chemistry at high school where people were taught that CO2 mattered, that we are carbon life forms, and they effectively are teaching negative chemistry now through the propaganda. People come out knowing less chemistry than they went in with, and we've undone all those years of it. So, you know, again, I know we're trying to talk about the structure of science, but I keep coming back to the education system that feeds into it and the media that assesses it at the big ends of this debate, to see how we need more checks and balances, as well as ones within the system that Peter's talking about.
Is it fair to say that a large part of the problem is the fact that most scientists outside the realm of probability and statistics don't understand either of those fields, but draw on them extensively in a mechanical way? But in peer review, they never get reviewed by real statisticians or real probability theorists. And that's a large part of the problem that you've been pointing to, Peter.
Yeah, it's certainly a significant part of the problem, but the problems with statistics actually has been more of a problem in the biomedical area, where they use major statistical trials all the time, and a lot of people don't understand. For the problems of the reef, actually, statistical problems is not the main problem. You can actually look at the data and see that, you know, as I mentioned, pesticides just don't get out to the reef. So why are we saying pesticides are killing them? You don't need any statistics at all. If you can't measure it, how can it be a problem?
Harry,
I
have
come
you
in with
got any
another
more?
audience question? Yeah, we've got one from Simon Conway Smith here, and he asks that in the US, he says there was a suggestion for a red team, blue team approach, and would the panel support that?
Yes, that's exactly what we want. And that's really what this Office of Science Quality Assurance is. It comes back to what Jeffrey was talking about before, where you want the devil's advocate. That's what the red team is. It's been used in the military for close to 100, probably more than 100 years, where in the military you need a subordinate to be able to say to the general, this plan of yours is completely crazy. But of course, the subordinate doesn't want to do that because he could lose his job or worse. So you set up a red team whose job is to challenge the general, and the general knows that that's the job of this person, and that they'll take it in their stride. Yes, that's what we need somehow or other.
I think one of the things as well is that it doesn't need to be in all science. I think it really the problems. I mean, there are problems in medical and psychiatry and things as well, but they have sort of auto correction mechanisms. They've got commercial interests. People will look at them, and in the end, the scientists have got to get clients and things. We really are talking about this area of environmental issues where the answers don't become apparent for a great deal of time, and maybe never become apparent. And so, the red team, blue team, you can't apply it to the million papers a year which are produced in scientific journals. You can't even apply it to 1% of that million. But so you've got to narrow it down, and we are talking about the environmental sciences here.
Yeah, it's actually slightly broader than the environmental scientists. There's other areas like criminology, education research is absolutely rotten. I wouldn't trust any of it. But it's the same sort of thing. It doesn't have that auto correction well, does it work? I mean, as I said, before the 1960s, it was military. Did the bomb go off or didn't it go off? It was as simple as that. It was going to be found if it was wrong. With this stuff nowadays, it could be another 100 years before we really decide that, oh, well, actually, maybe the Earth is not going to cook, or maybe the reef is going to be okay. After all, with the reef, we've been saying that it's on its last leg since the late 1960s. That's how long the scare story on the reef has been going on for.
I mean, I like the idea of a formal red team versus a blue team, but I'm still worried. I mean, in a sense, in science has so many different divisions. There's physicists, astronomers, and engineers. But what's happened across the science world is that all of them have ended up working to the same task, which is how do we increase the pool of money from the government to the university? And that always has the same answer. And so we're not getting doctors or physicists standing up and saying, well, hang on a minute, on climate science, this has been forgotten or this is wrong. We're not getting any of that red team, blue team behavior from the different areas of science. So again, we still struggle with that incentive system where ultimately, if everyone's funded by the big government, they are agents of big government. So I don't know if we could consider any other funding system or any other way of getting that incentive structure changed. And I open it to the floor if anyone watching has got ideas that they can send forward too, because I think we really struggle with the incentives in this one. As long as the money's coming from the government, I kind of feel like the answers are going to always be big government.
And the government, the money is coming from the government, and it's going to go to areas which are innovative, which means that you've got to find some problem. So you've got to massage the problem and create it. If it's coming from the government and your tenure in a university depends on something being innovative, it's got to get published in a magazine. You're not going to get something published in a magazine very readily anyway. Say, well, we looked at this and it's wrong. Because that's just not very interesting to other scientists. It might be interesting, but it's certainly important for policymakers, but not interesting for magazines, nor for those handing out the grants.
There are journals now dedicated to replication studies. In fact, there's a journal of irreproducible research. But one of the issues that hasn't been brought up so far, which I'm wondering whether or not it is very important, is the issue of transparency. James Cook University did a review of a PhD student, her research some years ago, And one of the things that struck everyone was the fact that no one actually knew what she'd done, including herself. So in one experiment, she didn't even know how big her sample size was. In another one, she knew the sample size, but didn't know how many fish, it was a fish behaviour experiment, had been reused. I mean, it's extraordinary to me that these sort of situations can emerge. But I guess in an environment where no one's checking, as Peter would say, that's exactly what happens. But maybe increased transparency would go a long way to at least uncovering the sources of the problem, if not what to do about them.
I think that's right. It's one of the many things that needs to be done. In fact, there's a guy called Etienne Lebel, who's a psychologist, who's got a website, I think it's called Saving Science or something like that. And he's really going into this problem of replication and the problem of transparency and that data is not put up. For example, you know, he's a Canadian, apparently the Canadian Research Council or whatever it's called, insists that if you get Canadian money, you've got to make the data available, right? But the fact is they don't enforce it, they don't police it. And therefore half the people don't put the data up, there is no transparency. A lot of scientific studies, you can't actually replicate them anyway, because they haven't actually done it in a way that, they haven't reported it in a way that you can actually replicate it. So there are huge sort of nuts and bolts type things which can be improved. And to be fair, the scientific establishment, especially in the biomedical area, is now starting to look at those. But the problem is much bigger than just transparency, but it'd certainly be useful to look at that.
Well, I guess in the biomedical area, they've got the problem of huge billion-dollar lawsuits when they get things really wrong. And we don't seem to have that so much in the environmental area. People are not launching those lawsuits to make sure that data is investigated at the highest level. So it's completely gone under the radar in terms of that rigorous analysis.
True. I think that's right. I saw one of the comments, somebody was saying that, you know, in cancer research, the company has a huge vested interest in pushing the stuff on the public. And so you can't trust the public, the company at all. But at least there are some protocols to, you know, to check the stuff. And if the thing ends up being, you know, poisonous and kills people, then the company will lose a lot of money. The other side of it is, say, my sugarcane farmers on the Queensland coast, they are being affected to the tune of at least $130 million a year just in lost productivity for having to reduce their fertilizer input. And it's based on absolute rubbish science. And there doesn't seem to be any way to sue the government or whoever you can sue for loss of income. And they should be able to do that somehow.
Just to emphasize how much different the environmental area is in this respect from biomedical, not only do we have this requirement for matters to be published, we have the opposite requirement being introduced in stock exchanges, that companies are making adequate plans for global warming in terms of their future strategies and publishing these and being required to actually abide by these plans. So we're not only not having the issues aired, but we're having the issues being required to aired in the opposite direction, which all of us know to be the correct one.
Shall I come in with another audience question here? We have one from Peter Gill, who says, has a question about meeting proceedings. How can science progress if challenges are ignored and not reported? And if so, how can we return to proper recording of actual proceedings of meetings? And I think part of this question links to a few other ones we've had about the media and how science is reported in the media. And I think because of the polarization that we see around a lot of environmental issues politically, that means certain news sites and TV stations are more willing to challenge that, but others won't accept it at all. And unless we can sort of get over that polarization, then people will look at these issues through a polarized lens rather than a scientific lens.
Well, if there's quite a lot in that, and I may have forgotten what the first bit of the question was, but the polarization bit really shouldn't come into it a great deal, you know, I mean, I know the climate change thing is a bit of a complicated thing, but these other things like the Murray-Darling and the bushfires and the Great Barrier Reef, there are no ifs or buts about these things. You know, the Great Barrier Reef is in fabulous shape. Agriculture is having almost zero impact on it. There should be no polarization. The reason there's polarization is our scientific institutions are utterly untrustworthy here. And if we could only get the real data out into the media, then the polarization would cease. But of course, the problem is that we've been told since we were 5 years old, you're supposed to trust the scientific institutions. To not do so is almost like a mortal sin. And if we can sort out these scientific institutions, I think at least in a lot of these issues, the polarization would just evaporate.
And can I just add, I saw John McLean mention the journals and perhaps putting some requirements checklists on them. So at the very least, we need to insist that all papers published must have the checklist ticked off. They must have the data submitted. The data must be available. People should be able to see it. But then we come back to the problem that people are putting out press releases before they've even put out the paper, and no one can check the paper or even check to see if it has data because they're not even publishing the paper when they put out the press release. In some aspects, and this is quite depressing, we get back to science policy and wonder whether science policy is largely set by the media. And rather than the scientists are just the excuse, but the media is the one setting the policy. If they turn their lens onto an environmental problem from one point of view and simply keep repeating stuff. In the case of fires, we've got guys who fight bushfires coming out saying climate change is the problem. They've got no background, no experience and no knowledge of climate science, which it shouldn't, and I wouldn't argue with them speaking because it's a free speech thing, but why is it they're coming out and saying things about climate change? And the answer is because they're saying stuff that true scientists could never say. You know, Andy Pittman can't come out and say, yes, we know climate change causes droughts in Australia, because he is a climate modeler and he's luckily got enough scruples left to not be able to say something which is completely wrong. But guys who are firefighters, who you know, expert at what to do with the hoses in the tanks and whatnot and the back burning, they're coming out making climate modelling statements, and science policy to some extent is simply set by the media and who the media decides to shine a lens on. And so, you know, this is really difficult because we come back again to that same problem. How do we get public debate out there when the media's entire aim, for the most part, is to simply repeat the religion? And so I come back to the free speech and the debating angle. And I might add, years and years ago, just to show you something completely different in there, I had a debate with Andrew Glickson on my blog, Professor Andy Glickson, and I thought it worked really well. And I would like to see more of this. And I don't know if we can get some system for this. We had something like 5 posts each on my blog. We went back and forward. He did a whole post. I think it started on Quadrant, and then I took over. And so he made his arguments to explain to all us silly deniers how the world works, and I responded. It went back and forward, and it ended with me saying, well, you are welcome to keep going. Where's number 6? And he did promise to send number 6 in, and I think, you know, 10 years later, we're still waiting. But I thought it was a really useful format because by doing it in writing, we could really get across, not with the theatre that you have on public forums and public debates, because it wasn't that instant back and forward response. It was a thought out one post per every week or per every few days. It was really very intellectual in that points were considered and numbered and listed. And so I'll just toss that one out there in terms of my quest to see if we can get actual public debate on environmental topics and somehow foster that.
Well, if the scientists won't debate, you'd have thought the politicians would want to see it debated, because they're worried that you know, they're going to be imposing costs on their voters that could end up being detrimental to their careers as politicians. But I don't see any appetite in any of the parties anywhere for, you know, the position of trying to hold science to account.
Well, it would
just-
to do so would be suicide for most politicians. If you said, look, I don't trust, because if you're starting to say, I want to hold the Commonwealth, the Australian CSIRO to account, or the Australian Institute of Marine Science to account, you're saying you don't trust them. Now, you shouldn't trust them, but for a politician to say that, they're now going to be in the newspapers, in the ABC as the denier. Now, we do have politicians like that. George Christensen, Senator Rennick, have really been banging the drums brilliantly on these issues. Pauline Hanson's party, Bob Katter, they're doing it, but they're the outsiders. They're not inside the two major. Well, some of them are on the inside of these parties, but they're on the outside of these major parties. It's political suicide because the scientific organisations are like a mafia, and they will beat up anybody who tries to cross them. But in North Queensland, you know, because we're a bunch of rednecks up here, you can get a lot of votes by beating up the scientific organisations, because we don't believe that the reef is in any significant danger, because we actually go out and see it and we know it's just not true.
And of course, that's not to forget the great efforts we've had from Craig Kelly in Sydney, and also from Malcolm Roberts, who's been really screwing down the CSIRO, our huge scientific institution, which gets more than $1 billion a year for scientific research, and he's been forcing them to give some answers, which is great. But I mean, Peter, and we haven't talked about your situation and just the fact that you didn't even have free speech as a professor to say what you wanted to say and put your view forward. And to me, it's a sickness in our academia, which is so deep. I mean, James Cook spent, what was it, maybe $2 million defending their right to sack someone who said something they don't like. So scientists are not in control of science. Who's in control seems to be the vice chancellors.
Yeah, well, that's just one more problem that we've got. It's not the biggest problem which we've got, but it just adds to it, that there is now fear that if you step outside and you question. So I was fired for questioning the quality assurance at the institutions. I said it wasn't up to it, and I got fired for that. And of course, everybody, look, all the other scientists, there's plenty of other reef scientists around who may not agree with everything I say about the reef, but they would be similarly skeptical about some of the things. Well, what are they going to do when they see this? So they're going to just zip up. There's no point in saying, there's no point in, you know, I'm approaching retirement. I effectively have, I guess. But if you've got a mortgage, you've got your kids at school, you can't take the risk. So that's just one more problem which we have.
And again, we get back to the media. And, you know, I noticed in your previous answer, Peter, you talked about the media and why politicians were so afraid to step outside the permitted bounds of things. And again, we come back to it's the media deciding public kind of policy on things. No,
it doesn't come back to the media, Joe. I disagree with you on this.
Okay.
It comes back to the scientific organisations, because they feed the media, and they know exactly how to feed the media so that you can say something that's strictly scientifically correct, but you can guarantee the media will exaggerate it or slightly misinterpret it, so it means completely the opposite, right? I could give you some examples of that. That in the end, the media are just reporting the bad news that is provided by the untrustworthy scientific organisations. If we can sort out those organisations, the media, yeah, they'll still blow things up, but they can't blow nothing up, right? If there's nothing there, they can't blow it up. So we've got to sort the scientific organisations before the media.
Well, I guess we'll disagree on that one, Peter, because I think the media in this are the problem, and it doesn't matter if a scientific organisation, and there are a few, have come out and said, you know, actually most engineers and geologists don't believe in the grand theory of CO2 in climate change, and the media just simply won't report them. And we look at guys like Ivor Giavo, you know, Nobel Prize in Physics. Our ABC is not ringing him up to say, why is it you don't believe? They're not ringing up Harrison Smith. They're not ringing up, you know, people who've walked on the moon to say, now, why would you come out and say something as silly as you don't believe in global warming? Because they don't want to know the answer. So I kind of think a lot of the science associations, they are a problem. And they've been captured by the left by little committees of 6 who stood up to self-appoint themselves as the spokesman for the Royal Society of whatever. But the media is the problem, because they're not even questioning those pronouncements coming from these science associations. They're simply picking up the ones that suit their own agenda and repeating anything that it suits their agenda and ignoring anything that doesn't.
You know, whether it's the media or whether it's the scientists, the problem is exemplified by one of the questions I noticed coming through, talking about the possibilities of companies financing the alternative perspective. And this was indeed Jeff Sherrington's question, was what happened at one stage in my career, where the companies financed us to look at some of these environmental issues and to put a contrary view. But the companies doing so were BP, BHP, Shell, all of these companies. Now, the money they give now isn't to finance a skeptical point of view, but to reinforce the kinds of views that are topical, partly because, well, largely because if they don't do that, they get attacked by shareholder interests, narrow interests, and it affects their share price. So the CEOs, whether or not they believe in global warming or whatever the issue is of the day, they really have to toe the line or see the share price fall and see discontent amongst their shareholders.
Yes, and the money they put forward is protection money.
Exactly, yes. But before, it was actually money contesting the obvious falsehoods which were being put forward. That no longer is available. No company that I know of gives any money there. And the Koch brothers apparently used to give some money to it and vilified throughout the US and in the election campaign there.
So can we find ways to fund science through philanthropic donations from private people so that research can be freed up from this ARC kind of grant footage? Can we foster back to the original days of scientific research before, as Eisenhower warned us, science was captured by the government and turned into a tool to create more big government? Because I know I can only say what I say on my blog, thanks to help and donations from people who send in, you know, lots of small donations that give me the freedom to say what I think. And wouldn't it be great if we had scientists who were funded through that mechanism back to the original source of science?
But, you know, the problem, as you pointed out in your blog, is that it's less than 1% of the funding that you get for the skeptical view then goes to the views which are creating these stories and these new factoids.
And another problem is that, say, for example, on the Great Barrier Reef, that the cane farmers all got together and they employed Peter Ridd to write a paper on something that was wrong, all right? Well, what would happen is that the other side would say, oh, well, he's just been paid by the cane farmers. We don't have to even worry about it, right? And that's why I believe that we need some of the money to come from the cane farmers, some of the money to come from the government. The government money launders, it cleans the dirty industry money. I know it doesn't really, but in the eyes of the people who think that anything that a drug company does must always be wrong, anything that an oil company does must always be wrong, the government money will clean that. So I think there can be a contribution there. But if it's 100% paid by private industry, they'll just ignore it. That's what will happen.
Well, and again, it's the media. It's the media are the eyes that have crafted a debate where everything the government funds is angelic, and everything funded by industry of any sort is the devil incarnate. And that debate has completely been set, that agenda, by the media. And maybe not through some clever, well thought out plan. I think the media is largely run not by conspiracy, but by culture. It's just, you know, the culture of the groupthink in the media driving it, rather than as if Murdoch sent an order from above to tell everyone to do something.
Isn't that the fundamental problem though, really? I mean, all these problems, the common element is a cultural one, isn't it? I mean, at the bottom of it, the education system, the higher education system, government, you know, business. It's the fact that the culture now has got to the point where they don't like hearing contrary views and they feel comfortable about all lining up together on a single view. Didn't used to be the way when I was at school, when I went to university, it wasn't that way. I mean, I went to ANU at a time when, you know, it was unthinkable that people would stop you saying something you didn't like to hear, that they didn't like to hear, sorry. But it seems that we've gone so far now, we've got to a point where there are people who readily won't have anyone say anything that they find offensive. And I'm not talking necessarily about science, but just on the larger issue of the culture.
Well, and this is where we get back to wokeism and the culture of the woke, of the collectivists, of the wordsmiths, rather than the number guys. The number guys have been talked right out of most public debates because ultimately, I guess, the wordsmiths got control of the microphones. They got the megaphones of society, and numbers have been extinguished. I mean, look at the climate debate, and there's virtually no numbers in it. It's simply down to ridiculous little bumper sticker truisms that people put forward, which are not true. Climate change causes everything.
But I think Peter's experience, doesn't it, gives us some hope. I mean, Peter was able to use GoFundMe to finance part of his legal costs and has successfully done that through the original trial and the first appeal in the federal court. And I believe, fingers crossed, Peter, you'll get through to the High Court okay. Maybe that's the way to go for funding some of this research. You know, we can't do it all, but we can certainly start to do some of it.
Well, I think that the case, you know, with regard to me, has certainly shown that there is tremendous interest and worry about this whole thing. That there are a lot of people like us, the people who are watching this webinar. There's a lot of us who are worrying about it. So you don't need to be, you know, you can be a little bit optimistic. I am actually optimistic that in maybe 10 years' time, we will start to turn around these processes in science. It's looking fairly grim at the moment, but I think that in the end, because the other areas of science are sorting themselves out, they're looking at the problems of peer review, and everybody knows it's complete junk. That they can't deny the problems in climate science and Great Barrier Reef science forever, that we will get there because there is interest there.
I think that's true. I mean that comes back to the collapse of communism. In the end, you know, if you've got a bad theory, it's gonna be found out, but it could be a long time coming, and that's the depressing part for all of us. You say 10 years, and hopefully that comes true. But 10 years even is quite a long time.
And I think the scary thing about what you're going through, Peter, is there must be so many young researchers out there who are watching it and thinking, would I want to risk having to raise that kind of money on GoFundMe and to hope that I get picked up by organisations and institutes like the Institute for Public Affairs to help me go through a similar debate? And I think at the moment they would be saying, no, I would, you know, and that's where it was so important that you win. And it's so important that we got the funding to take what you're doing and that you're willing to go to the High Court, because we all know it would have been so much easier for you to just sit back and do nothing. But I think for those young researchers, we have to wage these battles and we have to win.
You're right. I mean, the $1.4 million of public is just incredible. I mean, we can't stop now. We just got to go. With all those people behind you, you've got to go forward. But you're right. I mean, if somebody came to me at the moment and said, look, I'm in trouble with my university, I'd say, gee, you know, it's such a risk unless you have the backing of some big friend, whether it's the government or somebody who's going to beat that university round the head and say, no, you're not going to do this. We give this university a lot of money to do the things that universities are supposed to do, and free speech is one of them. And if we think that that university has crossed the line, then we will take, you know, literally millions of dollars away from you. That's the sort of cultural change which is need to be forced on the universities to allow those young people to step out of line. And, you know, it wasn't always as bad as this. You know, Bob Carter, who this webinar is in memorial to, he once ran foul of somebody who complained to the universities before the present Vice-Chancellor. The Vice-Chancellor's name was Bernard Malden. And my word, Bernard went into bat for Bob. He wrote back to these people and said, you can complain all you like, but Professor Carter is a university academic, And if you've got a problem with him, then you argue with it, but don't talk to me. That's the way it used to be done even just 15 years ago. But now, oh, well, you know, somebody said the wrong thing about climate change, we'll silence that person.
And can I say, we have had a win lately, haven't we, Peter? In that, I think, was it Dan Tehan or one of the ministers has finally said that institutions need to, thanks to the French review, need to have employment contracts, which are better than the one you had, that give them the right to speak. Is that correct?
That's correct. They're trying to push that through Parliament now. So that's Minister Tehan, plus with the assistance of Pauline Hanson's. So they're changing the Higher Education Act to define academic freedom and what isn't academic freedom. But we also do need to have some fines and some penalties and a police force, which will actually go in and say, JCU or Murdoch University is another bad one. You've crossed the line, it's going to cost you 10 million bucks. That would start to cause serious cultural change. So things are looking up in terms of the academic freedom debate, and there are renegade politicians like, you know, Craig Kelly and the rest of them, and we will eventually get sanity to finally prevail and make science trustworthy again. I don't have any doubt that we're going to get there, but it's just a question of how long.
And can I just put the call out then to everyone who's still watching, and bless you for sticking with us, because it's a long discussion, that I know on the right and in the conservative circles and scientific number minds, people often say, look, it's not worth writing that one letter. It's not worth that phone call to so-and-so. I'm just one voice, one letter to the newspaper. And they underestimate over and over again how much that pressure, the leverage we have, if we really isolate and screw down a minister like Dan Tehan or a science minister, someone to say it is ridiculous that we are sending any money to an institute which will not allow its professors to speak, and that the money should just be held. It should all just be paused. It could be a tweet. Donald Trump's solution is the tweet that comes out and says, we're just holding that money until you fix this. And that will solve things. But that's what we need to, I guess, force our elected representatives to do something so that there are consequences. And maybe it isn't a $10 million fine. Maybe it's just, well, no money until you fix this. And we're waiting. Can you do it tomorrow?
It sounds like we might need something like the Free Speech Union that Toby Young established in the UK. I believe he's helping to defend academics that have come up against the wrong side of university administrations for speaking their minds. Harry might like to talk because I think he knows the background far better than I do.
Thank you, Jeff. Yes, Toby Young has set up the Free Speech Union, and they have a whole team of lawyers who go in to bat in for academics like Peter Ridd, who have been maybe sacked or somehow punished or isolated because they've just spoken their mind. And it's not just in academia, it's across so many sectors of employment nowadays. We see people saying things that are judged as not politically correct, that are therefore seen as terrible sins that people have to be punished for. And so by actually creating an organization, he has allowed for an extraordinary amount of pushback, and it just means that they have to have a second thought before they start doing these totalitarian actions, that actually maybe someone's not going to just sit up and put up with it, and they're actually going to be pushing back. So it's been a really wonderful development to see the Free Speech Union, which is acting like unions traditionally should act, which is just defending its members from normally unwarranted and unfair attacks. I thought it might be good to just get one more question in that I saw come up on the Q&A panel, which was, how is this coronavirus pandemic going to change things? There's an associated economic crisis with that, and we've seen politicians around the world say, we're following the science, And yet, at the same time, I think the public have a sense that there isn't just the science, there's different ways of interpreting the data, and political decisions have to be based on so much more than just having a single idea about what the data is showing. So perhaps the public have, from this experience, have gained an important lesson that might help the public debate in the future. So I wondered what the panelists thought about that.
I think, in fact, the first thing about it is that the great response to COVID in all governments has been, we've got to kickstart the economy. And kickstarting the economy, in the case of the EU and the UK in particular, and of course in Biden's America, means we've actually got to redirect a whole lot of funding to renewables, which will of course exacerbate the problem because it doesn't kickstart the economy, but it retards the economy. So the first reaction to COVID is basically it is going to aggravate the sorts of problems we've seen already, and also it's aggravating them by making governments think it doesn't matter how much we spend. We have a Victorian government has come out with its budget this evening, which has got $150 billion plus of debt. I mean, that's a colossal amount of debt for a state which just a few years ago had $8 billion of debt. And the response to all this debt is they're going to spend more money. They're going to spend more money and orientate this money into into opposing climate change with more renewables and the capital assets which allow renewables to operate without crucifying the whole of the industry. So, you know, COVID first off has created a lot of problems and exacerbated the sort of problems we've seen from governments, big governments over the last 20 years anyway.
And can I just, because in the mood to be devil's advocate and a bit controversial, say that I think part of what medical science is paying for at the moment is the loss of trust. All those years they did not stand up and say climate change is not rigorous science, climate change is not as good as what it should be, and they never pointed out the flaws in, argument from authority and obeying the institutions and the lack of rigor and power review and whatnot. And they're now paying for it because they lost the trust of a lot of the right. And when doctors come out and say things about coronavirus now, the right is almost reflexively skeptical because they've just seen so much junk science go under the bridge. And I think that's a big price the medical institutions have paid for not having used their power of influence before to speak out when science was under threat. Instead, they spoke out to join in and make the threat worse. And, and I'm speaking this as someone who did medical science as a degree, and my major was in virology and genetics. And I think a lot of the advice about the coronavirus, I come from the kind of radical position that a lot of it's been correct, except that no one closed the borders soon enough. And that is the huge thing on the right, I think, that people have missed, that we should have just shut the borders. All Chinese bioweapons deserve to stay in China, and we wouldn't need a lockdown if we didn't let the virus in. And so call me the anti-lockdown girl. I didn't want a lockdown in the first place. We just needed to keep the damn virus out. But once it's in, I think the doctors are right. We have to do something. The hospitalisation rates are astonishing for COVID, and we have to do something just to stop hospitals from going under. But I think what we're looking at now is that the science brand name has been tarnished. It's been tarnished perhaps irrevocably from the great wins of the Manhattan Project and the things done, the man on the moon and whatnot. It's been tarnished so badly now that a lot of the population just don't trust it anymore.
This debate could go on for a very long time. But I think we've probably reached the end of our time. Even though we didn't advertise it, it would go this long. I've let it go because I think it was very valuable to do that. This, unfortunately, will conclude the webinar. It won't conclude the debate. And I hope you'll join us if we're able to do this again. On your behalf, I'd like to thank the GWPF and the AEF for hosting this event. And certainly I'd like to thank our speakers for such an informed and lively discussion. And on their behalf, I'd like to thank you for attending. You've been very, very patient. You've stuck with us all the way, and your comments reveal how much you've enjoyed the experience. I think you've enjoyed it as much as we have in bringing it to you. So thank you. Good night from down here. Good morning from some of you over there. I'm sure there'll be another one of these in 2021. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
You-
Good night.